That's up to you, Teresa. You're in charge.
All right, we are beginning. So today I would like to welcome you all to the September webinar of the Religion Communicators Council. My name is Teresa Faust. I am the president of the RCC. Note that it was founded in 1929, so we've been around for a while. I always read our mission statement before we start our webinars, so we'll begin with that. The Religion Communicators Council is a professional association that provides opportunities for networking and professional development for communicators of faith-based organizations. RCC recognizes and cultivates excellence in communications of religious faith and values while advancing religious literacy. So our monthly webinars are one of these opportunities. Thank you for being here, everyone. Before we jump in, I know we have a pretty big group, but I like to try to give everyone an opportunity to make a very brief introduction. I find that that is helpful for all of the participants and perhaps also for the speaker to have a glimpse of who you are, where you're from, that sort of thing. So I will begin. Teresa Faust, president of the RCC. I live in Dayton, Ohio. It's about 45 miles north of Cincinnati. I specialize in communications research, and I'm currently working with a firm called Triangulum Insights. Let's see. I am going to hand it off to Dan. You already mentioned, told a little bit about yourself,
Right.
but since we're recording now, go for it.
I'm Dan Gangler. I'm retired director of communication, the Indiana Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Thank you, Dan. Let's go to Ryan next.
My name is Ryan Coe. I am the director of the New York Office of Public and International Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I also serve as the vice president to Teresa's president.
Thank you, Ryan.
And let's go to Tim.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I'm Tim Tanton. I am in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm the chief news officer for United Methodist Communications and have the privilege of working directly with several people on the call, including Heather.
Thanks, Tim. How about Dale?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dale Gunn Lawton, and I am the newly arrived deputy in the office that Brian directs, and very happy to be joining you all and happy to be starting off on this new career. I just retired about 3 weeks ago as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, just sort of like Ryan. Apparently, this is the kind of person that comes into this job. So anyway, happy to be here.
Well, welcome. Watch yourself, you know, the footsteps you're following.
Yep, good footsteps.
All righty. Glad you're here. I am going to select Lila. I probably said that wrong.
Hi, everyone. Lila Marigza. I'm also with UMCOM based in Nashville. And I used to attend these RCC meetings regularly. It's been a while, but it's good to be back. I'm here today because I heard Heather was going to be speaking. So I'm here to support Heather.
Thank you. I apologize for mispronouncing your name. Let's see. Sungmi, you're next.
Everyone, I'm Sungmi Holdos. I'm based in Alabama. I work for Family Federation for World Peace Unification remotely. They're based in New York in their communications department. And yeah, I've been part of RCC for a couple of years now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks. I appreciate it. Actually, when I do it, I can remember better who I've called on so far. I don't want to forget anybody. Tom Kim, you are next.
Hello, everyone. I am Thomas Kim, an elder of Northern Illinois Annual Conference and director of Korean and Asian News at UMCOM since May 2018, after serving local churches for 25 years in the Northern Illinois Conference. I'm looking forward to hearing Heather, my colleague. Thank you.
All righty. Next up, Anutama.
Sorry, I came late. I wasn't sure what you were doing for the first minute there, so I'm glad I got a chance to hear some of the people being introduced. My name is Anutama Das. That's a Sanskrit name. I'm a communications director for ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. I'm hoping one day we have an elder, as they do in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who can shorten our name as opposed to making it longer, but we'll see what happens with that. Based in Washington, D.C., Director of Communications, and I've been a member of RCC. I was trying to remember, I believe since 1993.
All righty. Thanks for that, Anutama. You have been a member for a long time. We appreciate you. Next, Jim Patterson.
Hi, everyone. Jim Patterson, United Methodist News. Here to see what my colleague has to say.
Excellent. Welcome. Kalinda Fisher. We're just doing brief updates. Can you hear me? Or brief intros. All right, I'm going to jump to Father Jim.
I know he was on his phone, so I hope he's still
Okay.
able to hear.
Okay, let's jump to Andrew.
Andrew Schleicher, soon to have a title more like a BI analyst with United Methodist Communications.
Welcome. Paul.
Hi, friends. My name is Paul Gomez. I work at United Methodist Communications with all of these lovely folks as well, and currently stationed in Phoenix, Arizona, actually really close to the Gilbert Temple on the east side of town, and just partner in a lot of the faith work that we do together. World Council of Churches delegate, Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations, and all those fun things, and just really happy to support a colleague and friend today.
Welcome. Thanks for being here. Let's go to Ginny, who says her name is Religion Communicators Council. She's it.
So I could go incognito. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Heiser. I'm with Religion Communicators Council. I'm executive director, so the staff person for RCC. Get to work with all these wonderful folks, so good to see your smiley faces today.
Thank you, Jenny. So James Gardner is Father Jim, and he is on the RCC Board of Governors. So if he's not able to do an introduction, that is my quick introduction. And Kalinda Fisher is a colleague of mine, and she has done some work with United Methodist Communications, and she is a researcher and a sociologist. So welcome, everyone. And I want to make a couple remarks about Heather, because this feels like a little like the band's getting back together or something like that. Heather is an award-winning reporter who has worked for United Methodist News for 14 years. She is current She is current assistant news editor. She previously edited the Arkansas Conference newspaper, and before that, she worked as a reporter and an editor at newspapers across the U.S., often covering the religion beat. She is grateful that United Methodists live out their faith in so many ways, and she never lacks for stories to tell. Heather was a colleague of mine when I worked at United Methodist Communications. She has vast knowledge and experience reporting news for the global United Methodist Church. Those are my words. She has a fabulous personality and speaking style. I know this will be an informative, engaging, interactive webinar. There are some of my previous colleagues on this webinar, and I'm thrilled that you are here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather. And Heather, you can let us know if you want to do Q&A as we go along, how you want to do this. I think it's going to be informal, and we're going to communicate. So I'll turn it to Heather.
Okay, well, I was thinking it was going to be at the end, but I can do this as in the middle. Ginny, if you don't mind, just let me know if somebody's got a question in the chat, if you don't mind. I kind of got 15, 20 minutes of stuff to say, but I apologize to all my United Methodist colleagues on this call, because all this stuff I think y'all know. I just put it together. And so, but in any case, without further ado, and I'll start out. So anyhow, the United Methodist Church, you probably know, is the second largest Protestant denomination in the US, and it remains an influential part of many American communities. But as y'all likely also know, or you've actually experienced, the United Methodist Church has been going through some things these last few years. And as a reporter for United Methodist News since 2010, I've gone to watch closely as much of this conflict has unfolded. But first, a little history. To get a sense of how we got here, we have to go back 52 years. That's when the 1972 General Conference added the statement to our social principles, which is our statement of social witness, that all people are of sacred worth, but the practice of homosexuality is, and I quote, incompatible with Christian teaching. Before that, our social teachings, and indeed our entire book of discipline, said nothing one way or the other about homosexuality. But after 1972, the denomination's stance on LGBTQ people's place in the church became a recurring subject of debate and protest at each General Conference. The Legislative Assembly, which typically meets every 4 years, later added more restrictions, and that included banning clergy from officiating at same-sex unions or weddings, and banning clergy who are, in the words of the discipline, and I'm going to quote these words, self-avowed practicing homosexuals. Clergy found guilty of these church law violations could face loss of credentials or lesser penalties. But even as a majority of General Conference delegates kept affirming these restrictions, the church bands began to face increasing defiance in some quarters of the United Methodist Church. Simply put, many United Methodists had and have different biblical interpretations when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion. We also have had LGBTQ members since the very beginning of the Methodist movement. If you need to know a little bit more, you can look up John Wesley's correspondence with Thomas Blair, who was the early Methodist Holy Club supported, even though he was in prison for sodomy. Anyhow, to go back, but we also, in addition to having this history, we also operate as an international, I should say, denomination in many very different legal and cultural contexts. So it's a very difficult situation, and matters reached a crisis point during the 2016 General Conference, when rumors began swirling that the United Methodist Church was facing an imminent split. That led the delegates to pause consideration of any legislation related to LGBTQ people and authorize our bishops to form a commission to find a way forward as a last-ditch effort to keep the denomination together. Two other developments in 2016 bear mentioning. That year, the Western jurisdiction elected Bishop Karen Oliveto, who is our denomination's first openly gay and married bishop. And by the way, she just retired this year. Also in 2016, the Wesleyan Covenant Association also officially launched as a new traditionalist advocacy group in the denomination. At its first public gathering, the WCA presented a statement to the then forming Commission on a Way Forward. The WCA's message: find a way to hold clergy accountable on matters of homosexuality, or prepare for a denominational split. The Council of Bishops called for a special session of the General Conference in 2019 to take up the Way Forward Commission's proposals. And those of you who are United Methodists know that they faced multiple proposals, but I'm going to focus on the one that prevailed, which was the traditional plan. And it prevailed by only a relatively narrow 438 to 384 vote. And it was intended to strengthen enforcement of our ordination and marriage bans at the time. In a separate vote by 420 to 390, the 2019 delegates also approved a policy allowing churches to leave with property if they met certain procedural and financial obligations. Put a pin in that, it will be important later. The 2019 General Conference also voted that any legislation it passed would not take effect in our church regions in Africa, Europe, and the Philippines, what we call the Central Conferences, until 12 months after the close of the next General Conference. This is 2019, remember? And at that point, the next General Conference was planned for May 2020. No matter what United Methodists hoped before the 2019 special session, it soon became clear that the gathering had not resolved all our fights. It had not ended the debate or the defiance. Regardless of how they voted or their personal views, just about everyone present at the 2019 General Conference agreed it was a miserable experience, and it certainly did not help our Christian witness to the world. So church leaders moved to talking about a formal denominational separation. The year 2020 brought two big developments for the United Methodist Church. The first was the announcement of the negotiated Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace through Separation. Under that legislation, the traditionalist United Methodists would be able to leave the UMC with property and denominational funds to form a new denomination. The other big development is something all of us here know all too well. That's the onslaught of the COVID pandemic, which, among other things, halted world travel and led to the postponement of General Conference. The protocol never came to fruition, and at the most recent General Conference, which was held earlier this year, it died in committee. But in some ways, the denominational separation promised to the protocol had already taken place when this year's General Conference met. At least that separation took place here in the US. As COVID continued to cause havoc with travel, and I should add, cost millions of lives, General Conference continued to be delayed. And so the Wesleyan Covenant Association and its like-minded allies decided to no longer wait for the protocol to be considered a General Conference, and instead went ahead and launched the breakaway denomination, the Global Methodist Church. And that's when disaffiliations in the US really took off under what we call under this 2019 approved disaffiliation policy. And if you really want to be a church nerd, we call it paragraph 2553. But anyhow, not all that relevant. Also, 30 churches in Bulgaria just left to join the Global Methodist Church when it launched without any recourse to church law. What we saw in the US is what largely had been a debate among denominational leaders at the upper echelons of the church was seeping down into the local church level. That was happening, as well as false accusations spread largely on social media that the United Methodist Church was abandoning core Christian tenets like our belief in Christ's resurrection and the Trinity. Now, I'll be honest, covering this from the inside of the UMC was a whole different experience than what I had experienced as a religion reporter for a local newspaper covering splits within the Episcopal Church. This was many years ago. For one thing, covering it within the UMC, it was a lot, before when I was working for a local newspaper, it was a lot easier to remain detached from the whole situation when it wasn't affecting my employer. Once the Global Methodist Church officially launched and began actively recruiting from the UMC fold, sometimes in extremely misleading ways, the dynamics of our coverage also began to change. By 2023, our focus was almost exclusively on the people remaining United Methodist, their feelings, their hopes. It also became my job to cover what disaffiliations meant for the UMC as a whole, such as the implications for the denominational budget. And by the way, we just recently cut our denomination-wide budget by about 40%. One of my tasks became keeping track of just how many disaffiliations had received the necessary approvals. I also looked for bright spots and found that in many new United Methodist faith communities being planted by United Methodists who decide to stay after their church is disaffiliated. It's really exciting to see that, I have to say. But, let's get clear about where we were with disaffiliations. And for this, I'm going to have to do something a little different. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here about that. Can you see it? I'm seeing
yes.
it. Excellent. Okay.
Well, are we supposed to? I can see.
We see
half of it.
almost.
There we go. There we go.
Much
Good.
better.
Yeah, okay, you can see it now. Anyhow, this is basically, so you can see it, it's our regional, the regional distribution, and you'll see a lot of percentages. And half of our disaffiliations took place in what's the southeastern jurisdiction, which is sort of a group of our southeastern states. And I mentioned the western jurisdiction earlier. That covers our western states in the US, as well as Hawaii and Guam. So that sort of gives you a sense of what we look. And I have to tell you that the UMC saw a much higher percentage of disaffiliations than our fellow mainline Protestants that had undergone similar separations over LGBTQ inclusions. And most of our mainline Protestants, by that I mean the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and the Presbyterian Church USA, the disaffiliations that they experienced, the church separations, were about 10% or less. Altogether, between 2019 and the end of 2023, when the disaffiliation policy officially expired, we saw about a quarter of our US churches leave. That translates to more than 7,600 congregations. The Global Methodist Church, which now has a total of 4,715 congregations, is holding its convening conference as I speak in Costa Rica. And perhaps revealingly, you see a lot of my colleagues here, none of us are down there covering their meeting. After all, the UMC funds our ministry, so it makes sense that our focus is here. So to be clear, the United Methodist Church separation is pretty dramatic, but it also pales in comparison to the big US Methodist split over slavery in 1844, which happened to be a precursor of the US Civil War. That divide led to about 40% of Methodist Episcopal Church members leaving for the Methodist Episcopal Church South. We don't have total membership figures yet, but current estimates are that we lost about 24% of US members through disaffiliations. While the United Methodist Church has members on 4 continents, there is also no question that current US political divides, including over the handling of COVID, you remember how intense that was, played a role in what went down here in the UMC. An indication of that political divide is that 88% of our church exits took place in counties won by former President Trump in 2020. So that sort of gives you the setup, and I'll discontinue my screen share. That's the chart I wanted you to see. And as you can see, again, we dominated the South. That was where a lot of our disaffiliations had. All of these statistics in mind, and knowing that a lot of the people who were conservative and backing these bans had left, I still was not prepared for how different this year's General Conference would be from its predecessors. It no longer felt like a pitched ideological battle. In fact, those of in this room who were there will remember that on our last day of General Conference, we actually all got sort of sang together the OJ's Love Train. It kind of encapsulated the mood of the week. And yeah, there's a lot of agreement. Over 10 days, delegates eliminated the denomination-wide ban on self-avowed practicing gay clergy, the denomination-wide ban on clergy and churches holding same-sex unions, the mandatory minimum penalties for clergy who perform same-sex weddings, the denomination-wide ban on using United Methodist funds to support groups, activities, and causes that promote the acceptance of homosexuality. And just to clarify how this is going to work in real life is that we're going to be able to fund resources to help prevent suicide among LGBTQ youth, which had been sort of held up, and this is going to allow us to do that. These changes passed not only with sizable majorities, but in many cases were passed without debate on the General Conference consent calendar. To get on the consent calendar, a piece of legislation must receive no more than 10 no votes in a legislative committee. That is, essentially, they need to receive a supermajority of votes, and they must have no implications for our denomination's budget. So again, if it's on the consent calendar, it goes up, and you get 600 or more people voting for it, and there's no debate. We passed a whole new slate of social principles, and that eliminated the 52-year-old incompatibility language I mentioned earlier. But by far the most debated and narrowly decided part of these changes was were those around marriage. Many of our African delegates made clear their desire for the UMC to spell out a definition of marriage as being of one man and one woman. It's interesting to note that General Conference ultimately adopted language on marriage brought forward by a delegate from Zimbabwe. She suggested, and again, I quote, a double-barreled definition of marriage in our social principles that she said would reflect the laws around the world. So starting on January 1st, the social principles will read, and again, I'm going to quote it, we affirm marriage as a sacred lifelong covenant that brings two people of faith, an adult man and woman of consenting age, or two adult persons of consenting age, into union with one another. The Sunday immediately following General Conference, we saw palpable joy in some of our churches and great disappointment in others, especially on the continent of Africa, where some 30 countries still have laws criminalizing homosexual acts. Even in African countries where no such laws exist, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, homosexuality is regarded as strictly taboo. And by the way, Congo is the country with the second highest number of United Methodists outside of after the United States. So I say that again. By the way, Congo is the country with the second highest number of United Methodists after the United States. With all that in mind, General Conference approved legislation early on that ensures central conferences can set their own ordination standards and their own rules for solemnization of marriage. See that? Let me say that again. They can set their own rights when it comes to marriage. In the days after General Conference, bishops in Africa and the Philippines released statements saying that no same-sex marriages would be taking place in the areas they lead. Still, we have already seen some fallout since the big meeting. The conference in Côte d'Ivoire has voted to leave and has entered the United Methodist process to become an autonomous church. That won't likely take fully place until 2028 at the earliest. We also had 218 more U.S. churches leave this year, and they did so with the permission of their individual annual conferences, which is, for those not familiar, it's kind of our equivalent of, to use the Mormon language, a stake. I guess it'd be probably the closest analogy. Anyhow, most recently, there has been a split among United Methodists in Nigeria after the bishop there decided to leave and join the Global Methodist Church. But it appears that the majority of United Methodists in the country plan to stay. So far, at least, even amid our different laws and different views on marriage, a majority of our African membership does appear to be staying UMC. I don't know what the future holds, but my prayer is that we will find a way to stay together despite our differences, and that we live into Christ's calling to love our neighbors as ourselves. I genuinely see signs that United Methodists around the world and across the theological spectrum share a similar hope. So that's my thing, and I realize it's a lot, but I'm here to answer questions, and I'd love to hear from you all about dealing with your own religious divides. And obviously, I realize I'm talking to mostly United Methodists who know this very well, but any questions you have, I'm happy to answer.
I have a question, Heather.
Sure.
So this is a big, convoluted, kind of, huge thing. And maybe from my point of view, I've seen people who are very into it and interested, and then there's other folks that like don't care, whatever, right? Even within the United Methodist Church, like there's, so how did you go about like trying to explain this, trying to get this across to people who had such diverse, like where they came across in this?
Yeah, I mean, my goal was always to sort of explain where things are. And of course, unfortunately, or fortunately, we have a lot of distinctive terms as we talk about our organization, what's General Conference, what's a book of discipline, what are our social principles. And, and so a lot of what I end up doing is explaining some of that. What are those things? But yeah, I mean, for getting to talking to people, we really do want to be fair and present the multiple perspectives. As I said, the biggest change was that a lot of the people who have led to the organization of the GMC were, in fact, they were all the leaders, were all former United Methodists, many of whom I talked to over the years for various stories, including on this dispute. And when they left, all of a sudden I was not talking to them very much, but we still have conservatives within the United Methodist Church. And I really do want to consider, and not just in Africa, in the US as well. But at the end of the day, and I do know this, if your church never talked about this and never took a vote and everything's fine, this doesn't really, you can go about doing your business. Your church life this seems really remote from your church life. And even if and for a lot of people, it wasn't until, really 2022 that you saw a lot of churches all of a sudden start debating this. And it was really rough. We've now put forth, there are now resources that come from Perkins, which is one of our seminaries at SMU. And Holston Conference is just putting out some stuff, and Alabama, West Florida. No, I take that back. I'm sorry. South Georgia. They all have put forth resources to help churches heal and people heal, because it was really disruptive. Even if you stayed, it could be really hard. Lots of churches lost members. But we also had churches gain members because they were coming from churches that disaffiliated, or they just, they want to get away from the debate. So it's a very odd thing. We're seeing a bit of a realignment. We have shrunk. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm not saying we have, but anyhow, I'm blathering. And so I hope I answered your question.
Ryan, what's your question?
So I have a couple of questions, and maybe you answered it and I just missed it. But all the churches that disaffiliated, did they disaffiliate to a separate block, or are they all like individual churches?
They were all individual churches. And so and again, we even had our top court. We have a church court called the Judicial Council that said no annual conferences. And I'm going to use that's our judicatory. It's kind of like a diocese. But anyhow, they cannot leave unilaterally in the US. It's a little bit different overseas, but in the US, there's no process for them. They have to, they basically are here. But individual churches can leave, and that's what we're seeing. And so, and no, they didn't automatically join the GMC. If you notice that, we lost 7,600 churches. The GMC currently has, again, about 4,700 churches, more than that, but anyhow, more than 4,700 churches. And that includes churches abroad, many of whom were formerly UMC, but but it's not just like they didn't automatically go to the GMC. But it is true, even churches that didn't join the GMC, those that left tended to be very traditionalist, very conservative. And
Heather, real quick, can you clarify GMC? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Maybe everybody knows what that is.
Yeah. That's the Global Methodist Church, and that was founded essentially by the leadership of the Wesleyan Covenant Association. We actually have another breakaway called the Methodist Collegiate, what do they call themselves? Methodist Collegiate Fellowship, I think. Anyhow, they were churches that broke away mostly in Texas, and they decided that they were forming a fellowship and they were going to work together. And but anyhow, they're tiny, and they were not you talk to them, there's not really any beef with the UMC. But with the GMC, Global Methodist Church, sorry, there's a lot of anger. I would love for the day when we can have full communion and we're all together again, as if not necessarily in one church, at least as brothers and sisters in Christ, exchanging what that phrase means. We're exchanging bread and the cup together. But it's not like that right now. I mean, I think it will be at some point, but there's a lot of frustration and anger.
And then I have a second half of my question, and it's more communications focused then. Was there any kind of concerted effort to put forth talking points or lesson plans or whatever for the different priests, for the different outreach specialists, to have it be, we're choosing different paths, but neither one of us is going to hell? Or do you know what I mean? Like a way of maybe trying to temper that schism or that split, And also just the name United Methodist, was there any kind of discussion about we're not exactly united anymore?
Yeah,
Or,
I mean,
was there any kind of, I'm curious about the communications aspect.
absolutely. Well, I'll start with the United Methodist because the name comes to us and it's on literally all our legal paperwork. So it's not going away anytime soon. We might, but it really would be a big deal. And the name comes to us because the current incarnation of the United Methodist Church formed in 1968 with a merger between the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church at that point. And by the way, I mentioned this big Methodist split that happened in 1939. Everybody came back together in 1939. 1844. They come back together in 1939. And they also segregate Black members, not one of our shining moments. And then they merged again in 1968, and we get rid of that segregation. And the EUB is part of us. And the EUB traces its roots back to essentially German American movements, Wesleyan inspired movements in the United States. And they themselves are a product of a merger in 1946. So we get together. It really is very much in line with what you're doing in New York, because it comes out of that sort of post-war, the United Nations is now here. We've got the World Council of Churches. We are trying to bridge a lot of divides. So the EUB, so we really wanted to keep that part of our name. And so the United Methodist, that's what we put as part of our name, is United. To go back to your next question, which is about communication, I work in news, so I basically would not have been necessarily part of the development of this, but there were in fact talking points that were developed in alliance with other folks in my agency at UMCOM to basically put out talking points. And at that point, the talking points were not nobody's going to hell, although maybe that should have been part of it, but it was mainly, please stay UMC and we can be together. And so there was more towards, and we even had the hashtag BeUMC, and we put t-shirts out, and we did have talking points. But this, I gotta say, when you were talking about this, it did occur to me that the protocol was introduced to the public in January, and I can't give you the exact date, but it was like January 2nd, I want to say. It was right after, people came back from the new year. And the exact same day that the protocol was announced to the public was the same day CNN had this story about this new coronavirus coming out of China that we were now just learning about. So at the same time that the protocol, at that point, the main focus was trying to make sure the protocol got passed. It wasn't necessarily about dealing with the divide. That became our work for the next, that became the work of the next 3 months. And then General Conference we basically March, Tom Hanks gets sick, an NBA player gets sick, we stopped the NCAA, we all shut down. And and basically we didn't even delay our General Conference until our venue delayed. The venue, we were supposed to meet in Minneapolis. Anyhow, so that's when we shut down. So in a weird way, it became all about COVID. And then honestly and truly, focus because of our new commitment that we clearly didn't have in 1939, but our commitment to racial justice and equality, we really, churches really put out, after George Floyd's death, we really wanted to be an anti-racist church. So we put resources about that. And actually everything related to the protocol got put on the back burner. And then after General Conference continued to be delayed, and really the final straw for the WCA was when it was delayed in 2022. Early 2022, they're like, okay, we're not getting the visas we need for our international folks, and everybody's backed up, and we know we can't. And so we're going to just delay it again. And at the same time, they're like, we're not going to even bother in 2023, even if things loosen up, because we're going to have another General Conference in 2024 anyway, so we might as well do that then. And that's what we did. So, and so that's when, as I said, things started accelerating. And by then, well, I gotta say, things got intense. And I think, honestly, this is more opinion and not really any based on a study, but I do think things were aggravated in part by, disagreements about COVID closures and going on Zoom and how we were handling this. And a lot of stuff that was in the ferment of the US was also affecting the United Methodist Church in the US. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
No, it's all very, very fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
we-
you know, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I want to clarify one thing. When the traditionalists left, for instance, in Indiana, we had 1,000 churches to begin with. We had more than 325 leave the denomination, but of those 325 congregations that left the denomination, only 20% of those went to the Global Methodist Church. The other 80% went somewhere else. Most of them, we found out, went independent, and they became an independent congregation tied to no denomination.
Interesting. In terms of just the amount of, I don't know, discord or dissatisfaction, I'm not sure what the right word is, but very complex, not just things happening within the church, but things happening around the world, which is what life is like. We don't operate in a little vacuum. Some more questions. Dale, what is your question?
Coming back to Ryan's sort of idea about the communications aspects of this, I remember reading some of the articles that came out around the time of the split, but I wondered, you know, how did you see it covered in the sort of non-religious press, in the mainstream press? And were there efforts to influence the coverage in the mainstream press of how these how these things were being perceived, and what how that coverage might go out to the general public, whether you were involved with it or not? I'm sure you observed.
I'll be honest, my biggest thing is I kept trying to tell my colleagues, and you know, some of them were really excellent. This was not an issue, but I kept saying, US churches, 7,600 US churches, because they would say, you know, they've lost a quarter of the whole denomination. That's not true. Even now, it's not true. Even with Code of Law, that's not true. You know, so I was always like, we're international denomination. We're the data you're using, which many of them would link to our coverage, which I really appreciated, was strictly speaking about US churches. I mean, because that's what we were keeping a regular tally on. And because that was the only thing really to keep a regular tally on. We knew about the 30 churches in Bulgaria. You know, so yeah, I felt like for the most part, the secular media did a pretty good job. I mean, they were very interested. They were willing to listen. General Conference proved a little bit different. And I'm going to be mean and talk about NPR, which I love. I'm a fan. But they kind of just decided not to really listen to us during General Conference, and they kept making something that was bigger than just the debate over homosexuality, all about the debate on homosexuality. We're like, no, this is a bigger deal than what you're talking about, and we really want you to make sure you understand. But a lot of people really were interested, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They called us up and they wanted to help, you know, us to help them cover General Conference and give them information that they could use. And so, yeah, I mean, I gotta say, the secular press did a good job. The biggest difference is that while we have our own, you know, obviously we have United Methodist News, there is a lot of religious press out there. And Christianity Today, they're going to be they know a lot of the folks involved with the Global Methodist Church. These are their people. The Christian Post, the same thing. And so they're going to contact them. They're not going to really be all that interested in what's going on in the UMC, except to say, I think is their attitude. But anyhow, that's a little bit mean. But they're not as interested in us as they are in the GMC, and that's understandable. And so, you know, that was sort of the interesting thing. But like the Religion News Service, they did a fantastic job. And a lot of our local papers did a very good job. And, you know, they would cover disaffiliations in their local area. And they did things that I would have done back when I was covering the, you know, and I feel like I'm like leaving out the ELCA and the PCUSA. It's just that by the time they were going through their splits, I was already working for the UMC. But when I was at the secular press, the Episcopal Church was going through it. And, you know, then I would talk to people, why you want to leave? And you know, what's going on, and tell me about the stories that you're having, and what's going on in your church. And you know, and I would literally get both sides, and I would talk to people with Anglican Church of North America, which was a breakaway for them. And I would talk to folks in the Episcopal diocese where I was, and it was, you know, that was your stories. And here, as I said, it's not that, again, a lot of the people founding the GMC, I had their cell phone numbers. These are people I know, but we were just a lot less interested in them because our readership was a lot less interested in them because we were writing for UMC people, and they were the ones, I mean, not to be put too fine a point on it, they pay our salaries, and so we serve them. So I hope that was helpful.
Sungmi, did you want to ask there you go. What's your question?
Hi, thanks, Heather. Yeah, this is all fascinating stuff. I guess I had a question about the staff of News, if there were any instances of maybe a personal conflict with covering this as the UMC made their position clear. Let's say if they're like from, I guess, the personal standpoint of those working for the news or in communications, if they didn't agree with the stance UMC was making, was there anything like that happening in terms of the message? Like you said, you're being paid by the UM to report on their news. Was there any, I guess, I don't want to call it a moral conflict. That's not what I mean.
Oh no,
but,
well, you know,
personal convictions, you know,
yeah, I mean,
with the stance of the church. Yeah.
You're dealing with people's deep convictions, and I have to be honest, yes, UMCOM, I'm not going to talk about UM News, our whole agency, there were people early on when I left, when they saw this debate heating up, who left United Methodist Communications. They just didn't feel like they could do it anymore. And but within UM News, our smaller staff, and Tim, when we were in 2020, we had what, 5 English language? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and Julie. So basically, we had 7 English language people. And my colleague Tom handles our Korean desk, but and is a totally amazing journalist, by the way. But yeah, we're journalists, so that was less, our background is in journalism, so we had a little less of that kind of conversation. We seemed, you know, our backgrounds were different, and for that reason, and so it was not for us individually a big source of moral conflict. I guess I should be very honest. A lot of United Methodist period welcomed the change that we just saw. And so for them, those that remain are very happy with it. Even those who disagree with those changes have decided that those changes are not church dividing for them. So that's basically the folks you're dealing with now. We are shrinking our staff, but I'm looking at my boss and making sure I'm not saying anything inappropriate. Tim Tanton is my supervisor, so he might go, stop talking. Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Tim.
No, sorry. Well, no, you're doing great, Heather. I would just kind of amplify a little bit of what you said, Heather, that one of the great things about UM News is that we do operate with editorial autonomy. So that means that our team really focuses on just telling the story as it is with objectivity. And so we have not, been in a situation with any of the major issues that we've covered over the years where we felt any pressure internally to do anything other than adhere to the highest journalism standards. So it has been interesting over the years covering a lot of these topics. I mean, because obviously we're all human beings and we do have personal feelings about things like immigration and inclusiveness, healthcare reform. I mean, gun control has been a big one in the past. But as a news team, we really just wear that mindset of objectivity And that's, that's how we've approached our work, and I'll say it again. I mean, I'm really grateful that the United Methodist Church and United Methodist Communications do actually have a team that has the editorial freedom to do that.
And I'll just add, my biggest beef has been, we actually, believe it or not, in the United Methodist Church have an open meetings law. And that is one of the things I spend a ridiculous amount of time championing. I'm like, it's paragraph 722. It's awesome. You should use it. Blah, 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 blah. Anyhow, so like that is the stuff I ended up getting passionate about. This meeting should be open under our church law. But honestly, truly, we try. People are pretty good about that. And so, that's been, I feel like that tends to be the stuff that I end up getting the most energized about.
Well, that's probably the journalist in you. Anutama, what is your question?
Yeah, two, if I can. One, I'm just kind of remembering, it wasn't too many years ago, and I really admired it because I thought it was such a wise way of branding the church, if you will. I may get it wrong in the order, the Open Minds, Open Hearts, Open Doors campaign, which was on churches all over town that I drove by, and it was attractive concept to me. Was that a preamble to the split? Was that an effort to keep everybody together? Was that oh my gosh, now we've really set off the fire because we've made such a, where does that fit in with the history? I'm just kind of curious.
It actually dates back 24 years. It was about 2000 and 2001. It really took off after 9/11. So that was the thing that, I mean, that's when we started really pushing advertising. We had a big ad over Times Square saying that. I gotta say, I was not working for UMCOM at the time. I actually did a story about the campaign when I was working in the secular press, and my understanding at the time was that it was not explicitly about keeping the church together. It was intended to be an evangelism tool to say, hey, we're open, and a branding tool, because it was supposed to be about saying who we are in this diverse religious, I mean, I hate to use this term, but diverse religious marketplace, why not? And it sort of set up our identity. Now, of course, as things intensified, that brand got tossed around, both sometimes disparagingly, sometimes, we should live into this. And over the years, sometimes it's been less emphasized in some places than others. One of the questions I had for my colleagues on the communication side and marketing side of UMCOM was, okay, now that the changes have made, is it going to change how we approach this? And the answer is, we really want to live into it and really say we are, I think this is the exact word, it is open hearts, open minds, and then the third is open doors, because we want to have people come through our doors. Now, the big thing is that we know that, getting people to come into church is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, and it's better to bring the church to the people. And so there's a lot more emphasis on that these days. So, yeah, that's helpful. Sorry.
Squeeze in a second. I'm just wondering, knowing that, 7,600 congregations, that's a lot of buildings, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from previous generations and all of that. How much was the financial impacts of the split a factor in terms of it slowed things down, or it made things more contentious, or everybody was like, hey, we're Christians, it's not about this world anyway, it's all about God's kingdom, and that this is a minor detail? Or, I mean, I can kind of see some people, digging in like, there's no way you're going to take that church out of this congregation. My grandmother built that church, it was her house, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just curious how much of a problem that was and what impact that had.
So the thing you're talking about, yes, that debate happened within the churches. My grandma built this church, and in fact, one of the churches the organist decided to stay United Methodist, but the organ that her family had basically dedicated to the church was going with the church building as a disaffiliate. Now, our disaffiliation policy required churches to pay some money to leave. we've landed in court with some of these cases where people don't want to follow that procedure. And so that's also been intense. And as I mentioned, it overall financial impact, we have seen a 40% cut in our denomination-wide budget. My own agency, UMCOM, we actually had a 52% cut in our overall budget. Now, these budgets last 4 years. And so things are a little bit, if I'm saying about, it's because that's kind of the way we work. You know, so we will still have to figure out the financial costs of all this, and that's going to be hard. But yeah, I mean, you hit it was very emotional for a lot of folks, because either they were seeing their churches stay, but they didn't want to leave, but they wanted to take this property with them. And just so you know, it's interesting because this was all anticipated, interestingly enough, by our founder, John Wesley, who back in the 18th century had a lawyer draft what we call the trust clause, which is basically says that all land is held in trust for the wider church and for the use of the wider church. And so even having this sort of workaround that was temporary around the trust clause was a big change for us. And this trust clause has been in our discipline since the 1790s and has been pretty well enforced by, you know, courts along the land, including by the Supreme Court in a case that landed there after the split in 1844. So we've had a pretty good track record. Things have changed a little bit with how the trust clause since then is enforced in the United States, but it is pretty well recognized. And so, yeah, we've had cases land in the courts and had to revisit that. Is it that helpful? And I don't know, how many questions you want me more to take? I'm being so blathering. I apologize. You can tell I'm not ready for prime time.
Goodness. Well, you're doing great. It's almost 3 o'clock Eastern, which is the time we wrap up. We have time for one more question.
I saw Dan have his hand up. You're going to clarify something
Yeah.
I said?
I just have a couple comments. One back to Anutama. For most of the congregations in Indiana to withdraw from the church, we're talking $250,000, $300,000. And you're talking of a lot of congregations under 500 members. So it was costly for a congregation to withdraw. What they had to do was pay into the pension fund for their pastors for the next year, as well as apportionments to the annual and general conference. So it was not an easy. Also, we do have traditionalists that remained in the church. And that has become quite another talking issue. No pastor is required to do a same-gender marriage. That's up to an individual pastor whether they want to do a wedding or not. Also, it goes back to the boards of trustees in our local congregations. Some trustees have banned same-gender weddings in their congregations. So we're still dealing with traditionalists being in the church and trying to find out what does that mean when we have such a large scope of theology within the same denomination.
I'll just add, in the United Methodist Church, marriage is not a sacrament, unlike in some Catholic traditions, for one thing. And so I don't know if that helps in that regard, but it might. But it's not a sacrament. So.
Well, I think it helps. It's another piece of information. And Dan, I appreciate your examples of real life, what you're experiencing in Indiana. So it's tough, and that's how life is sometimes, right? It's in all things. Sometimes it's good things, sometimes it's not good things, but we persevere and we keep going. And I think that's part of what the news crew did at United Methodist Communications. They just kept going. And I say that in a positive, it's a positive thing. And I am a little bit biased because I used to work in that organization. And again, I'm thrilled that I have so much representation from the communications folks. And it was tough for me to keep my mouth shut a little bit too. So, I like to talk and share. I am going to say this is a wrap. Ginny, do you have anything you want to share before we say goodbye?
I will put my email in the chat. In a day or so, I'll have this posted to our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to see it, just send me an email and I will make sure you have the link. So.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate it. It was very thorough, and I think it was a good little glimpse behind the scenes for folks that maybe have heard about some of this stuff, but now they're, Okay. Thanks. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.